Hey everyone, Dan Johnston here. I'm the Jack of all ministries, and today I'm going to talk to you guys just a little bit about room modes and standing waves. So in my last video, I was giving, dictionary terms and jargon, studio building jargon, stuff like that. And I talked a little bit about standing waves, and I also talked a little bit about room modes, but I said I wanted to go into a little bit more detail in this video because I think that this is a really important principle to understand if you're going to be doing some kind of studio build in your house or something like that. Of course, this can be a very complicated issue. It gets very technical, but my goal is to keep it as simple as possible so that it becomes useful information to you. Again, I'm not a sound expert or anything like that, but I feel like knowing this was a big deal for me in terms of getting my DIY studio project done. And so had I not known this information, sound treatment would have been just sloppy all over the place, trying to basically make it up as I go. And so basically what's going to happen with a room mode is if you do measurements in your room and you move the microphone around, you're going to find out that not every place in your room is going to sound the same, which is not too much of a surprise, but what happens is you can get really, really big SPL problems, sound pressure level problems in your room, and these pressure issues come about because of something called standing waves. Now, what a standing wave actually is when you have a wave that is in your room that is evenly divisible. Okay, so a traveling wave, it's like if you have a distance here from wall to wall, and you kind of get, a wavelength going across it, but it doesn't necessarily complete a full or even wave cycle. So when it kind of bounces off here, it just kind of does its own thing. And so as it's going one wave into the wall and bouncing back, as the waves cross over, it's not a evenly repeating pattern because the wavelength isn't equally divisible within the room. And so scattering in that direction, it doesn't really have any negative effect on the sound in your room, because if you're standing here, even if a wave cancels, well, the next wave coming through is going to be slightly off, so it won't cancel, and so the room will sound a lot more even if you have just regular traveling waves. But what happens with a standing wave is it's actually evenly divisible in your room. And so what that would look like is if you have a starting at a neutral point, you go high and then back down to low and then back up. And so your wavelength is actually equal within the room. Now, there are many ways that a wavelength can be equal in your room. Okay, so you may have a wavelength that goes up, down, up, down, up, down, and then ends up there. Or you may have even just a half wavelength, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So basically, as we have this thing called a standing wave here, what happens is as this wavelength returns off the wall, because it's evenly divisible, the track of it actually lines up with it. So in one stage, you're actually going to end up with a wave that is right alongside the initial wave that came in the room. Now, what happens when you have two wavelengths that are actually going even with each other, if it's the exact same frequency and everything, is you actually hear this double what it actually is. So what you're hearing is double the actual height of the wave, okay? So because there's two together, they double up, if you will, all right? And so that makes the SPL level double what you're actually hearing. Now, I should say that this is hardly ever perfect in a room, okay? Because when a sound wave hits a wall, not 100% of it gets reflected back, okay? You're gonna have some of it that's transmitted through the wall, some of it is absorbed. So having a 100%, a 90 dB wavelength that bounces back at 90 dB is probably never actually going to happen. So this is a little bit theoretical, but when it does happen slightly less, you still get an increase by taking a 90 dB wave and a 40 dB wave on top of each other. You're still going to have that effect that takes place. But as this wave actually cycles through, okay, what will happen is the wavelength ends up at a different part of the wave, okay? So, all right, we'll say it looks like that for a second. So your returning wave then may actually get to the point where what it actually looks like is this, all right? So when this happens as part of the cycle of the wavelength, you'll see here that all of these different things, right, there's always an equal, this distance, all right, is equal to this distance, all right? And that's the same all the way through the wave. And so what that actually does is you end up with phase cancellation. And if you remember in some of the other videos I've made, phase cancellation is when you have a high pressure and a low pressure wave even, and they cancel each other out. This is how noise reducing headphones work, or noise canceling headphones work, is it takes the ambient noise around you and then plays the, the inversive wave, if you will, and it cancels the sound in your ear, so you're only hearing what you want to hear. So at this point in the cycle, what you hear is this. Nothing, okay? So if you have standing waves, you have a wavelength going this way and a wavelength coming this way. Okay, imagine the blue wave is that way, the green wave is this way. So at this point of the cycle, standing here in the room, all right, if this was wall to wall, standing here in the room, at this point you're going to hear extra SPL than what was actually coming out initially. But down here at this cycle of the wave, you'll hear nothing, okay? So you have this very exaggerated sound that you're hearing because of the standing wave. Now, at these parts though, when you're standing here, you hear nothing because the wave is crossing over, right? And so at this point, you're hearing nothing. So that means if you are sitting at this point of the room, okay, little guy sitting there, he hears nothing at all at every cycle of the wave, okay? But if you're sitting right here, all right, you're going to hear an exaggerated form of what you're actually hearing, okay? So that is why standing waves can create a problem in your room. If you're at a point where there is a standing wave and you're sitting at a certain zone in the room, you may hear absolutely nothing at all, or not as much as you should be hearing, or you might be hearing double what you should be hearing. Now, like I said, that won't be exact because sound waves don't return at the same strength, and also you have to worry about different angles in your room. So maybe you have a standing wave going this direction, but this direction is not a standing wave, and so it can kind of blend and make things a little bit more even. That's why when you take a measurement of a room, you don't just see a bunch of like ups and downs, absolute numbers. You'll end up seeing more moderate increases or decreases. I would say that a common number that you'll see sitting in a room if you take a measurement is if you're playing sound, say 80, 90 decibels, in a bad spot, you may end up with 10, 15 decibels of increase. And of course, that's not absolute, but just, that's generally what I see work, in small rooms taking measurements, but that's, not an exact number. Now, the reason standing waves can be a problem is because it's an artificial attenuation or exaggeration of a sound. So if you're, in a recording studio and you have a pocket over here where, you're expecting to record drums at 90 decibels, okay? But at the 100 hertz frequency, it's only 70, or maybe it's 110. And it's not what it sounds like just 5 feet away. And it's like, wow, you look at your recording, why does it sound so different on the microphone than it does to when I was sitting over here? Well, the reason might be that you have a standing wave there, all right? Another reason is if you're in a mixing room. Let's say you're trying to do a final mix in your room, you want it to sound good. You're listening to it, man, this sounds great. You go take it somewhere else, you put it in, I was gonna say a CD player, but I don't know who would actually do that. But you put it on some other sound system, you're listening to it, and it's like, whoa, wow, the bass is really loud. It didn't sound like that in my room, I wonder why. Well, maybe it didn't sound that loud because where you were sitting when you were mixing is right smack dab in the middle of a standing wave or a room mode where there's actually an attenuation, but in real life, you're mixing it 5 dB louder than you thought you were. Okay, so that's why standing waves can be a problem. Now, when we talk about measuring all the different types of standing waves in a room, what you're going to call them are room modes. Okay, these are the modes within a room where you're going to have frequency issues. All right, so let's take a look at what room modes might look like in a real world example. Okay, so let's say we have a room here, and the length and width and height of this room is 20 by 12 by 8, okay? So let's say within this room, you want to figure out what your axial modes are. Okay, now what is an axial mode? Well, basically, those standing waves I was telling you about can work in several different directions. Now, the strongest standing wave issues you're going to have are your axial modes, and that means that it's limited to one axis. So basically, you have, ooh, that was horrible. You have this, and this, okay? You have your length, your width, and your height. Those are your 3 axial modes that you need to figure out. So basically that means you can have an axial mode or a standing wave that exists from this wall to this wall. You could have a standing wave between this wall and this wall, or you can have a standing wave from floor to ceiling. That's an important one that people forget sometimes because we think of our room being 4 walls when we actually have 6 surfaces that we're working with. And so basically you need to figure out what your axial modes are for your height, your width, and your length. And once you figure out what those modes can be, then that gives you an idea of what modes you need to treat so that your room sounds more evenly across the spectrum. However, those are not the only modes that you have to deal with. Now, the other 2 types of modes are called tangential. So we have axial, tangential, and we also have oblique. Now, these are all different modes, but they all have different strengths. So axial are the strongest. Your tangential modes are only about half as strong as your axial modes, and your oblique modes are about 1/4 as strong as your axial modes. Now, usually when you're treating a room, you start off with the axial modes, and you'll find that the tangential modes and the oblique modes kind of just fall in line. I don't know if that's absolute or not. That's just what I've read in my research, but it seems like if you can treat your axial modes, the other ones are going to kind of disappear because they're kind of related anyway. So your tangential modes don't just bounce between 2 walls, they bounce between 4 surfaces. Okay, so basically you're going to go from your back wall to your side wall, to your front wall, to your other side wall, and then back up to your back wall. Okay, so it's bouncing almost like a pool ball on a pool table if you bounce it off of all 4 corners. Okay, so that's how you get your tangential modes, because you have standing waves bouncing in those directions. Now, the other type that you could have is oblique modes, and those are a little bit harder to draw, but if you've ever played racquetball with somebody and they kind of hit the ball into the corner and it hits one wall and then another wall and then the floor, well, if you imagine that it then continues up to the adjacent corner and does the same thing up there, then you'll actually see that you're bouncing off of 6 different surfaces. So we'll say that you bounce off the side wall up to the ceiling, and then from the ceiling to the back wall, and then the back wall kind of drops down to the floor, which comes up to this wall, and then over to this wall, and then back over to the side wall. That's probably not accurate, but basically you're bouncing off of all 6 surfaces within the room, and I understand that's probably a horrible drawing, but that's just what I got. So basically those are the 3 different types of modes that you're dealing with: axial, tangential, and oblique. But your axial modes are the strongest, and those are the ones you go after first, and usually the other ones will fall in line. So how do you figure out what your axial modes are? Well, there's actually a pretty simple formula, and it's based off of the size of your room and the speed of sound. Now, the speed of sound, most people will calculate it at just 1,130 feet per second. That's the easiest number to use. It's a little more rounded. But I'm going to use 1125.2 today because I believe that's what the AMROC room mode calculator uses. Now, the speed of sound does change a little bit based on atmospheric conditions and things like that. That's why it's a different number. But it's fixed in whatever situation you're in. And so basically, I'm just going to use 1125.2. You can use 1130 if it's easier for you to do math that way, but I'm going to use it today to show you on the AMROC room mode calculator later that it actually works. So basically what you need to do is you need to figure out what your axial modes are for your 20-foot wall. You want to figure it out for your 12-foot wall, and you want to figure it out for your 8-foot floor to ceiling. And now I've already gone ahead and done the math on this, so I know what the numbers are. But basically you're going to take the speed of sound and you'll divide it by twice the length of the room, and that's going to give you your fundamental mode, okay? And then you'll multiply that out and you'll get your harmonic modes, okay? So your fundamental, it's the lowest point you're going to have an axial mode, okay? That is half of a wavelength. Okay, so if you remember what a standing wave is it's an equally divisible wave, okay, from surface to surface. Now, in the example I gave, it was one singular wave, okay, with a middle point where you have your beginning points at neutral, goes to high pressure, neutral, low pressure, neutral, okay? So that's one complete wave cycle that fits within the room. However, you can also have a half wavelength where you just get your first half and then the other half would theoretically take place outside of the room, okay? So basically a half wavelength is also a room mode because it's also evenly divisible. So that means every room mode then is going to go from a half wavelength, and then so that's your fundamental. Then you get a full wavelength, and that's your first harmonic. Then your second harmonic goes to 1.5, and then your next would go 2 wavelengths, and then it's going to go 2.5, and then 3, 3.5, 4, and that just goes on forever. So here's the thing with axial modes is when you start calculating them, it goes all the way up through the frequency spectrum, but we don't worry about every single frequency problem. That would be outrageous, and thank God he designed the world in a way to where it's not an issue, because there's something called your Schroeder frequency or your room crossover, where the standing waves in your room don't become as much of an issue because they act more like ray energy instead of wave or pressure energy. And what that means is you get like a ray of sound that's bouncing because the sound waves are so small that it fills in the area better, and they don't tend to get, you don't get diffraction and things like that. And so you don't worry about the ray energy, you just focus on the wave energy, and that is below your Schroeder frequency, which is going to be somewhere 100, 200, maybe up to 300 hertz. So in that window somewhere is where your Schroeder frequency is going to be. There's a pretty simple calculation you can do to figure out where that is. And so basically in my room, it's 257 hertz. So anything under 257 where there's going to be a standing wave, I had to intentionally go and try to treat that frequency. You don't have to do it that way. You could stop any frequency using just velocity absorption. But the problem is that it becomes really unrealistic when your wavelengths are 20, 30, 40 feet long, because you would need to fill your walls with 20, 30, 40 foot thick foam. And technically you could get away with doing less because there's a way to treat in the antinode versus the node, which makes it a lot more efficient. But basically the idea of using velocity treatment for really low frequencies is just unrealistic for our settings. Theoretically possible, but nobody's really going to do it. And so there are types of pressure treatment you want to use. I'm using a tube trap model, which specifically took out a certain amount of RT60, which is your reverb time. Took that out of my room at 2 very specific frequencies, which is great. That also takes up a significant amount of room. I'm also almost done building a variation of an ACDA, which is an acoustic fields design, which is fantastic. Very heavy. They're 110 pounds right now, and I still have another panel, foam, and some legs to put on. So they're heavy. But I'm excited to see how well they work, because from what I understand, they work phenomenally. But anyway, these specific types of pressure treatment that you can build or buy go for a certain frequency range and do a lot better job at the low frequencies treating the pressure rather than just treating the air molecules that are excited by pressure waves. So all that being said, knowing what your Schroeder frequency is important, because you'll intentionally go after the frequencies below that frequency point. Now, for our example, we're going to go ahead and stop at anything below 150 hertz. We're going to call that our Schroeder frequency. That's not actually the Schroeder frequency for this room, probably. For this example, we're going to go ahead and figure out what the axial modes are for each individual wall. So the way you do it is you take the speed of sound, okay, and then you divide into it the length of your room. Now, to get a half wavelength, you want to double the length of your room, because again, you're looking at double the length. So to get your fundamental, the formula is simply the speed of sound, okay, divided by double the length of the walls that you're looking at. So you start off this way. Alexa, what's 1125.2 divided by 40? So 28.13 hertz. All right, that is my fundamental frequency for my 20-foot wall. That is half a wavelength fitting into the room. It's at 28.13 hertz. So that means you're going to have an issue, though you'll likely have an issue, because there's going to be a standing wave between this wall and this wall at 28.13 hertz. But that's not the only standing wave between these walls. So let's see what a full wavelength would be. You just double that up. If you double that, it becomes 56.26. So then you can take your fundamental and multiply it by 3, and you're going to end up with 84.39, okay? So basically, these are all problem frequencies between these walls, and you can keep on going. Remember, I said the room crossover is 150, so we'll figure out all the frequencies below 150. The next one is going to be 112.52, and then we're going to hit 140.65, okay? And all those were just, continually, you know, exponents of 28.13. So times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5. We hit 140. The next one's going to be over 150, so we won't even worry about it. So those are the axial room modes for the 20-foot wall, okay? But remember, we also have the width and the height. So let's figure out what the fundamental is for 12-foot. That's going to be 3.33. And then we're going to figure out that the harmonic is 140.67. All right, and then we can go ahead and stop there because we have all of our frequencies listed out below 150 hertz. So if you take a look at these frequencies, you'll probably notice that on the length, width, and height, you're going to find that you have 140.65, you have 140.64, you have 140.6, that's actually 67. So basically, there's a pretty good clue there that between all walls, right about that 140 hertz frequency, you have standing waves in all three of those axes. So that means if you're going to treat a frequency in this room, 140 or so is going to be one that you're definitely going to want to go after, because no matter where you're standing, there's a good chance that you're going to be dealing with a 140 hertz wave. Now, and the other thing that's interesting about that is the nodes are going to move. Now, what is a node and what does that have to do with this? Okay, so let's take a look at this 140 hertz issue that you have right here in the room, okay, on the 20-foot wall. So if this is your 20-foot wall, that wavelength would look something like this in the room. And the reason why is because each of these is a half wavelength. So you have a half wave, a full wave, 1.5, 2, and then 2.5 wavelengths. So we have one wave here, okay? We have another wave here, and then we have a half wave there, okay? Now, remember I was pointing out to you that there were two different cycles. As this goes, it hits the wall, it bounces back. And so it reverses course and comes back this way. All right. And again, when it does that, what you're hearing does not necessarily match what this looks like, because these together double up the sound, so you're hearing twice that much. Okay. So what you're hearing is in the purple line there, okay? Now, if this is the neutral line here, what you're going to have is this is the point in the wave where where the wave actually gets its name, a standing wave, is because it's standing still. Okay, I'll show you this animation here again, and you'll see that as the waves are going back and forth, you see that what you're hearing is actually swinging very rapidly in these locations. But at these locations here, it's standing still, or it's stationary. That's why they're called standing or stationary waves. And so if you're sitting in one of these places, this is called a node, okay? The point where you're really hearing nothing, okay? Another place where a node would be is against the wall, okay? So sometimes if you're by a wall, we know that the sound is bouncing off of there, but sometimes the molecular energy is not moving because the pressure waves are kind of pushing it up, you know, kind of like in a wave pool, right? These waves are going through the pool, but all the people are at the end of the wave because they're getting pushed by the pressure. So the air molecules can kind of rest there and they don't move very well. It is still a node because you have low molecular energy there, but you have high pressure energy there. The pressure is really pushing there because there's resistance at the wall, okay? And so that's a node, that's a node, that's a node. So if you're in this room, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different places at 140 hertz across the room where you're going to sit there and you might not hear anything. Now imagine for a second that if you take a look at this particular, the width of the room, okay, we know that this is at the 1.5 wavelengths. So you can imagine that 1.5 wavelengths, right, you have 1 and then you have half. So if you're looking in the room there, you're going to have nodes here, okay, ish. And so basically, if you flipped this against the wall there, there's going to be nodes going across the room as well. And so if these actually end up at intersecting points, you could be having some real trouble in that point. And imagine if you bring in the third axis. So if you have a node that goes this way, and this way, and you're in that general area, you're really going to have a lot of sound being diminished or attenuated in that location. So nodes are where you have very low pressure, okay, and the excitability of molecules can be a lot greater because there's a lot more room to move around. However, when you get to these high pressure zones, you see those air molecules being pushed out of the way. And so because they're being forced out by the pressure, the sound is increased. Okay, so in these locations, these are called the antinode. Now, why is it important to know what those are? Well, because in your antinode, that's where you're going to have a likely increase in SPL, or volume if you will. If you're sitting in a node, you're going to have a decrease of volume in that location. And both of those are artificial. So you want things to be smoothed out a little bit. So what you do is you slow down the returning wave, okay, by weakening it up, by absorbing it or removing those artificial frequencies. And what that's going to do is, because there's less sound waves bouncing in your room to actually cross each other over, you hear more of the initial sound alone, which makes it a more accurate picture because the reflections aren't distorting that original sound wave. So that's why you want to use treatment to remove certain amounts of that frequency in your room so that things actually even out because there's less reflections. And that's a great thing for your sound quality. Now, in the node, that's going to be a place where a lot of times people try to treat, sound waves because they put things on the wall. All right, you put a piece of foam on the wall, so you're trying to treat that sound at the node, the point where there's high pressure, but there's low molecular movement. And so that's not always helpful because you want to be in the location where the pressure wave is actually manipulating the molecules. And so if you pull your velocity treatment off the wall, right, you mount your foam with a little bit of room behind it, not only are you moving it towards the node where the pressure wave is more active, but you're also giving it an opportunity to have more surface area behind it so that when it bounces off the wall, it can be caught by that, that actual sound treatment. And so pulling things into the room a little bit is very helpful. I read an article that actually a better way to treat bass issues in your room is, rather than stuffing things into the corner, because there is buildup in the corners, if you will, but pulling it out of the corner gives it an opportunity to reflect and then build up into, towards an antinode where then you can absorb some of the molecular movement. And so moving things into the room is actually very helpful in terms of sound treatment versus just leaving it on the wall. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention was the Schroeder frequency. And again, this is the frequency in your room at which you will stop worrying about the frequencies because you'll treat them as ray energy, just using regular absorption. And you'll start worrying about treating them with pressure treatment. You'll use this formula here. You take your RT60 time in seconds, not milliseconds. Now, what the heck is your RT60 time? That is the amount of time it takes for the decibel level in your room to drop by 60 decibels. So if you play a 90 decibel sound, okay, and the sound is reverberating throughout the room, how long does it take for that frequency to drop by 60 decibels? So how long does it take to go from 90 to 30? Now, you can figure that out by using measurement microphones and room EQ software, which is, REW is a great software to use for that. And so you measure it in your room, figure out what your RT60 time is, and so you'll end up by getting a number, and usually it's in milliseconds, but instead of using 200 milliseconds, you'll use like 0.2 for the number, which I'm using in this example down here. Now, then you want to use your volume, and you want to use that in cubic meters. You don't want to do that in feet. It's important that you do it that way to keep it accurately and consistent. And so I'm going to use the example of just 18 cubic meters. It's just kind of an example I threw out there. So you have 0.2 seconds of RT60 time, right? And then you have 18 cubic meters of volume within the room. Okay, so you divide that into that, and basically you end up with 0.0111, okay? And then you're going to square root that number, and you're going to end up with 0.1054. Okay, then you're going to take that number and you're going to multiply it times 2,000. And so, Alexa, what is 0.1054 times 2,000? 110.8. So your room crossover in this example would be 210.8 hertz. So if you could figure out what your RT60 time is by measuring it in your room, and then you can figure out what your volume is in cubic meters, then you can do this equation and figure out what frequency you need to use to worry about treating things for pressure treatment and then letting the ray energy be treated by velocity treatment. And that's going to do it for standing waves and room modes. I hope that you guys are able to use some of this information to go figure out what your axial room modes are, that it'll help you treat them later and that your room will sound a lot better. I know that in learning this stuff recently, it made my endeavors in sound treating a lot better, and trust me, my room is better for it in the end of it. And so that's going to do it for this video, guys. I appreciate that you have taken the time to watch it, and I hope that it was helpful to you. And if it was, I'd appreciate if you consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel, because this is the type of stuff that I love to tackle. And with that, I hope that you have a great day, and I'll see you on the next video.